Panel is titled now as a researchers panel, and the idea is that also now the researchers get pitched in a bit more. It is a research project after all. Our esteemed panelists are Max Sjöblom, Törhönen, Mikko Meriläinen, and Joe Macey. And I'll let them introduce themselves a bit more elaborately, but I think we're going to have the panel pretty unstructured, see where the discussion goes, and please feel free to ask at any point anything related to the things being discussed at that moment. All right. So let's start with the introductions.
All right. Hi again. My name is Max, and I think I covered most of what I do. So I study particularly media usage, streaming, gratifications, and from the kind of consumer perspective, and eSports as well. I think I'll let the other people talk more about themselves. No.
All right. Hi, my name is Maria. I come with a background from game production and games business development, and now I'm researching the production side of streaming. So I'm kind of looking into obviously eSports, but also the other types of themes that are in streaming and kind of the channels. And I'm kind of taking a perspective of the Western markets, and then in contrast the Korean market. So I'm researching both just to gather enough data to kind of compare the two, because obviously Korea is leading the developments in streaming and obviously eSports as well.
I'm Mikko, and I'm not actually a part of the research project, but more of an outside collaborator. I'm currently working on my dissertation on game education, which basically means that I'm trying to answer the questions that parents usually have on gaming, how we should deal with gaming from an educational perspective. That means I'm alternatively either defending or attacking gaming culture, so making my life fairly interesting, as well as my research.
Hi, my name's Joe, and I'm looking at the gambling aspects connected with eSports and with kind of wider gaming culture as well. As we've probably all been aware, the whole eSports gambling scene has started to hit the news in the last several months, particularly with Valve and the various kinds of CSGO diamonds, websites, controversies, stuff like that. So it's starting to be quite a hot topic. Unlike the others, I don't have any particular professional background in gaming, but been a gamer for a while, like probably most of us. Yeah.
And maybe I'll also say a couple of words. So I'm Juho Hamari, I'm the moderator of the panel. I work as a researcher at University of Tampere, and my research mostly focuses on gamification and game business, and nowadays also eSports and streaming. So let's start with the panel with sort of a icebreaker question, which sounds perhaps to be an easy question, but I think there are many aspects to it that make it an interesting question nevertheless. So do you consider that eSports is really a real sport?
Who wants to?
I can take this. I can start.
Go ahead.
I mean, obviously, what is a real sport? A lot of people would think it's something that is very physical. And then a lot of people obviously would consider that playing games wouldn't be that physical, but I would say eSports is definitely a sport. It requires you to be quite physically healthy, because obviously a fit body, fit mind kind of approach to this. And obviously it's a lot about the competition, the strategy, the ability to react really quickly. So I would say it's a sport as much as the other real sports. But yeah.
I'll go with a super boring researcher. Researchers answer like this to every single question like this. So it depends on how we define sport. But basically, if we are considering things like motor sports, if they are sports, if shooting sports are sports, then definitely eSports qualifies as a sport.
Yeah, I think perhaps from Erkka's presentation, he mentioned the fact that not all computer games or competitions in gaming can be eSports. And I think that's something important to take from it, because it's the kind of the direct competition rather than making a game from something. So there are certain ones which could not. So yeah, it depends how you define it. But I think there's parallels between lots of other sports, more traditional sports, which have been questioned as to their kind of sportiness, such as darts and snooker and stuff, which really struggle with the acceptance and the kind of the physical nature of the athletes, which is still ridiculed by some these days. So again, it depends where you're going, really.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially if you kind of consider the things that make a great athlete, especially on a very high level. It's all, of course, if you look at traditional sport, it's of course about the physical body itself, but a lot when you transfer from the kind of amateur to the professional is a lot about the physical mindset, kind of preparedness, being able to plan out your training, your kind of not to have like a good structure in your life for the training and for the event itself. If you're working towards the Olympics or you're working towards a CSGO major, the kind of same things apply, that you have to do certain things for good reasons when you're training, and then actually when you're there at the event, you train for so long, other people kind of crumble under the pressure. So I think in that sense there's so very many similarities. I also think this is a really interesting topic, because if you follow kind of well the Swedish media has had several articles on this recently, because there's this TV program called Mästarnas mästare, where you have these different kind of retired athletes that then compete, not necessarily in they compete in these different kinds of games, many physical, but also some kind of more puzzle stuff. And there's been this Heaton, who's this legendary CSGO player there, and then some other, I think it was a person, I don't know if he was actually in the program or not, but he criticized that, oh, what's this gamer doing here, hasn't ever done any sports. And then kind of there's been a lot of these kind of articles in different media outlets on the fact that, okay, is he an athlete? Does it even matter? And the fact, I think the Heaton is a good example. He's also a person, he also is quite physical in the way he does a lot of physical training as well, not just the kind of the CSGO training. So that at least has been an avenue where this has been discussed during recent weeks very actively, and brought this topic to light.
Yeah, and if you look at say dancing esports, they're very physical, right? So even not the physical aspect is not always the dividing factor.
And I also like to call in the question the whole relevance of the question. So is it really relevant whether it is a sport or not? It's also, I think, something to ponder, because should we aim to establish esports as a sport, as an actual sport, whatever that is, or should we find ways to accept esports for what it is, or sort of is there anything to gain from trying to legitimize it as a sport compared to traditional sports?
And I think as an extension of that, I think that soon it will be considered a sport. We were having this discussion now, but in 5 to 10 years, I think the mainstream acceptance. We've got someone asking a question.
Oh, well, let's take a question.
More like a comment. It's quite irrelevant question, I agree. But however, we have, like you all know, we have two big reasons why it should be sports. One reason is funding. It's sports they have way different funding instruments and everything, even in Finland. And second reason is the cultural acceptance part. That's my idea. But I think it's a silly question.
I was also going to bring that up. I think that's very important. That's one practical reason why we need to why it's good to discuss that, because some instances actually need you to have this kind of classification that, okay, this thing is now a sport, to qualify for funding and so on. It's also interesting, for example, in this one article I read now about this situation in the Swedish thing about Heaton, was that at least according to one of the kind of Swedish instances that say if a thing is a sport or not, also something that many of you would consider a sport. For example, MMA was not. It's not a sport according to them because of the kind of the negative physical aspects or kind of danger associated with that. Same as I guess some extreme sports are not. So they also have this kind of requirement of a certain safety level in the sport itself, in how it's built. So then suddenly MMA was not a sport, even though it's an extremely physical activity and probably something that would be considered a sport by most people.
Yeah, so even if we all agree to some extent that it's a sort of a trivial question, it is still important for the sort of the legitimacy of esports in the long run in Finland in general, right?
And yeah, and wider, because when I tell my family what I do, they say, "What's that?" You have to kind of explain it, and you have to have this conversation with people for them to be able to kind of identify with it and understand that it's even a thing, let alone is it a sport or not.
Yeah, it would be interesting to hear, like, because you're looking at the gambling aspect of esports, so it's another hazy thing on top of another hazy thing. So could you discuss a little bit about the gambling stuff that is happening around esports?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, obviously there's a lot of gambling connected with esport in various different forms. But there's little to no research at all on esports gambling. So there's some research which is happening about games and gambling, and the very limited amount that's connected with esports, particularly in gambling, is more about establishing the new environment for gambling. And with it, there's all these issues of all mixed together about problematic behaviours, about problematic gambling, problematic gaming, internet addiction, and conceptually it's still really very mixed at the moment. So I think one of the first challenges is really even to kind of define what is esports gambling.
Mm-hmm. It doesn't really help the matter that you have this whole big thriving Wild West sort of industry, which then after the announcement from Valve, just in 2 weeks was completely turned upside down, all but destroyed in areas, and so it's quite difficult to research something like that, which is in constant flux, and even people who are in the scene, working in the scene, aren't completely familiar of what's happening. Some trends might pop up, new sites might pop up overnight, and all of a sudden you have this new thing that's all the rage. In 2 weeks it might be gone. A week ago it wasn't there. So how do we as researchers sort of manage to grasp something like this, which can be like very, very fleeting and obscure?
Mm-hmm. That's a good point.
Have you ever, is there any studies actually done on the fact that as the name esports actually make it harder for mainstream acceptance, because sports is a highly emotional thing, and you've grown from a very little kid, you were like parents take you to your sport teams, events, and like sports is from with many people from very little. So when they hear esports, they're like, "Wow, that's not sports." That like upfront negative reaction comes from the name. But have you considered if it's called like electronic competition or whatever it's called, but not esports, would that actually make the mainstream acceptance easier, or like does that affect things?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay, I can start. I think, yeah, I've been thinking about this myself, because one of the things, if you look at what people write about this and discuss, one of the things is that people get really stuck on the sports word, because many people who are kind of, they might not be professional athletes, but sports is very important to them. I have like some family acquaintances are like this, that they care a lot about sports, and they kind of self-identify as like a sports person. So then when something kind of comes into their turf, they feel kind of attacked, and somehow that now, because there's this new thing, their thing is going to be worth less. So I think that, yeah, the kind of name is in a sense problematic here when talking about this kind of phenomenon. If it was just called like competitive gaming, then not many people wouldn't cause the same reaction.
Yeah, I was just thinking that, like, just as a comment, so maybe esports is just a subcategory of competitive, like e-gaming or something, and maybe you should like look at it from a wider perspective.
Well, I think that's one challenge is very much is getting these kind of definitions and these kinds of familiar terms established. And you've got to start somewhere, and usually they start in research, and you build citations and references from then. They become familiar terms, and there's what is esports, but then there's, as I said, like what is esports gambling, because okay, betting on an outcome of an esports match is pretty kind of conceptually clear. Like, this is how gambling works in traditional sports, it works with this, no problem. But is skins lotteries, are they gambling with esports? They're gambling, they use items connected to esports, but they're not from the game, and they're not of the game. So where is the line? Is this just a completely different behaviour? And so I think that, you know, we really have to do work in kind of establishing these terms.
Yeah.
One more comment. I think it's interesting to compare this kind of, if you look at the military and warfare and traditional warfare compared to somebody flying some drones or perhaps cyber war. Even if one is not sweating or bleeding, it's still warfare. So I would say that it's absolutely is sports. It's just the world becoming more electronic.
I think the term esports would be a problem in any sense, whatever the term would be, because we are kind of like, in that sense, the consumers at the moment are that generation who haven't been brought up with it. I think in the future there will be much more kind of educated people. You would know what it is, you would be interested in it, you could be brought up playing games to be a professional. Because I know for myself, I was always brought up to, you know, knowing the fact that games will never be a profession, which it is now, of course. But you know, we are a different generation. I think it just needs a bit more education to get acceptance from the general public.
And I guess to continue from that, I mean, you're studying why do people stream, for example, when they play games. So
Yeah.
could you maybe open up a little bit about that? Like, how does that come to be someone's job, basically playing games all day and like PewDiePie's and YouTube and stuff like this?
Yeah, I think that's one of the, I would say, next generation. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are doing it. It doesn't, you know, really matter what age group. But I think it's something that is becoming more mainstream. It's so accessible. You can go and broadcast anything right now. You can go and Periscope broadcast this right now. It is so accessible. So I think it's a very important topic that it actually has been researched a little bit on the kind of YouTube side, the pre-recorded stuff. But then live streaming and the different topics and the reasons why people do it hasn't been researched so much. So one of the aspects that I'm looking at is motivations. I'm looking at the culture, the business models, how do people make money? Because obviously it's a big business nowadays. I mean, anyone can go and stream, become popular. Well, obviously it requires a lot of work, but if you become popular, you can make a lot of money out of it as well, as just an individual. You don't really need anyone to back you up anymore.
Yeah, I think the kind of the whole kind of user-generated content, and if you look at Twitch or YouTube, it's like really amazing, and especially YouTube, because the reality is that everyone in this room is just really, really old compared to the people who are like heavy YouTube users. I was first amazed when there was some time ago, I went to the kiosk to buy something, and then before me in line was his dad and his daughter, and she bought this Tubettaja magazine, and I didn't even know there was like a printed magazine, and it was like, it said there that from the people who published Demi, which is this kind of paper aimed at teenage girls. I was really amazed that they make like a physical product for a digital medium, which is YouTube. And when we talked about Mari about this TubeCon, which is a big event where these famous YouTube producers come there and then their fans come there to meet them. And that the fact that the event is basically just packed with like really like children and teenagers. And they have this separate area which is called this kind of
Parents' corner?
yeah, this parents' corner where you can leave your parents, and then the parents can stay there, and you can go meet your idols. Yeah. And it's just kind of something that you forget, because it's so difficult to relate to those kind of 13-year-olds and kind of how they see the world, and how their kind of idols are becoming more and more these kind of peers that appear through YouTube or Twitch or any other kind of service in the future, and how important that's going to be when they grow up and they're like in their 20s.
Yeah. But Mikko, you work with like games education, and you probably face these kinds of discussions in your work. So what's the sort of dynamics between the kids and the parents, and the kids wanting to become pro streamers and popular people, basically?
Well, in most cases, the parents don't understand what's going on. So they are wondering, like, why would someone watch someone play games on the computer? Why would you want to watch that? And then Okay, and then I tell them that, well, why would someone want to watch other people playing ice hockey on TV? Why not do that yourself? Okay, so but basically the dynamics are such that that the parents are quite out of the loop. This of course hinders the possibilities of the children and young people, but they're slowly coming into it, because now, for example, I fairly often run into children who are doing Minecraft videos, and this is something that's fairly concrete for their parents to understand. So the parents are noticing that, okay, so as well as gaming, they're also watching videos, they're also creating their own videos. The parents might sometimes be really surprised that, oh, my 8-year-old just posted something on YouTube and it's actually like 1,000 people have watched it, and that's quite crazy. So parents are slowly grasping it. For young people, especially I think teenagers, it's also a way to a sort of a safe, well, in an internet context, safe is a relative word, but it's a way to engage with other people, to show things that you can do, whether it's streaming games, whether it's posting your pictures, your drawings on DeviantArt, or sharing your stuff on Etsy or whatever. So it's a way to engage with others, show what you can do, get some feedback, which can be fairly cruel at times, but it's still like a way to connect with other people.
I was wondering, you're talking there about, for example, like Minecraft being a kind of seen as a good or productive engagement. There is lots of stuff on with streaming about, like, you know, with these skins, lots of these people streaming lotteries, you know, playing lotteries, of people streaming themselves, opening loot cases and all these kinds of things. I was wondering what kind of effect that has on the children. Does that kind of normalize these kinds of behaviors and make them want to copy them?
I definitely think so. There's, well, I'm not going to say that children and teenagers are dumb, but they are limited in their like critical reflection skills regarding the media. So if you see someone, there was this case just a while ago with fairly famous streamers actually turning out to be staging their own lotteries using their own site and making these fake videos where they're supposedly winning a lot of money from these skin raffles. You know, if you're watching someone play a game every day, they become your idol, you're a big fan. And then, you know, at the end of the game, they're like, oh, you know, I've been playing CSGO for the whole day now, so maybe I'll just unwind with like this little CSGO lottery as well. Oh, what do you know? I just won, you know, 2,000 euros while doing almost nothing. Maybe you should try it as well. So if you're you know 15, that's quite tempting. You know, he's doing it, he's earning a lot of money, so why shouldn't I do it? So yeah, there can definitely be a bad influence there. There's not much of an ethics code at the moment for what's happening. There's like who should be responsible for the ethics code. So we don't. It's also spread out. We have a lot of independent functionaries and so on. So no one's really handling it. It's a good thing in some parts, but it's a bad thing in this context. But yeah, I think we need responsible streamers as well, and especially when dealing with gambling, we should be fairly aware of how actions can influence younger viewers especially.
It's interesting to mention the kind of responsibility of streamers, because a lot of these services already ban, for example, Twitch bans the act of like smoking on stream, and they limit that you can't be lightly dressed, or I mean, I don't know. I think they also limit kind of drinking alcohol on stream and such. So they're clearly doing it kind of in a sense to avoid lawsuits, but also kind of guiding this behavior. But then what do you know? Like suddenly there's no kind of limits on, for example, talking about gambling and kind of promoting perhaps your own something you have stake in yourself. So that's kind of important and interesting also.
But maybe the key takeaway is that parents and other educators, professionals rarely understand how big idols these streamers and YouTubers are. So we often consider them sort of like these second-rate internet celebrities, whereas they're huge. You know, you ask a 10-year-old and they can like rattle off 5 or 10 different YouTubers or streamers, but they won't they don't know Finnish comedy actors. You know, so this whole like thing is turning upside down fairly quickly. And when you have big idols doing things, saying things, they influence opinions. I think almost all of us here know that Teemu Selänen drinks milk. He was a big like face for milk ads. So that's probably got a lot of young people enjoying milk. So because if Teemu Selänen is doing it, then why shouldn't I?
Right. Yeah, and I think there was at Tubecon, there was this kind of, at least some, I saw on some social media, this kind of outrage that Crystal Snow, who's kind of performer, I think had this kind of something there and stated something along the lines of, well, you don't really need to, you don't really need mathematics for anything. And there were basically these kind of 12, 14-year-olds there, and they're like, okay, sure, thanks. I can just skip all these courses, and then people are kind of angry that, okay, hey, you're a kind of a role model for many young people. This is perhaps not something, even though you think so yourself, not something you should kind of be saying, because it might not be true for sure. I mean, some people don't need, but then kind of they don't really know at that age.
Yeah, I think the role model and like the sense of community and stuff seems to be pretty important in the streams. Maria, you've been looking at and thinking about the sort of the communal aspect of streaming.
Yeah.
So do you see this kind of behavior going on in there?
Well, I think community is such a big part of streams. I mean, of course, the production of streams is a lot about community building as well, and social media, being interactive, talking to your fans. So the streamer has a lot of influence, but the community has a lot of influence as well. So if a streamer does something, it's not necessarily the kind of the thing that ignites the trend. There might be discussion, streamer might do something, people might interpret it somehow, and then the community just explodes. And yeah, I think it's just something that people should be aware of, that it's not just the streams, it's also all the discussion, all the social media. There's so many aspects to the phenomena itself.
Yeah, so the streamers are kind of the hosts of a bigger community.
Yes, absolutely.
I think they also often serve as kind of they guide the community in a certain way. Certain streamers might have a, let's say, on sites like Twitch, if you have like big streamers that get over 10,000 concurrent viewers, the chat's going to be quite in chaos. In some cases, it's quite civil, and that a lot comes down to the kind of, if the streamer, what kind of line, if they think it should be cut clean chat and be civil, then they can kind of guide it in that way by kind of condoning offenders, whereas then some other streamers might just want, they say it like, okay, I just want the maximum amount of viewers, how can I do that? Well, I'll kind of make controversy happen in my chat, and they don't kind of moderate it in any way, and that can get quite quickly out of hand and creates like a very hostile environment full of like racism and sexism and so on.
Yeah, that's actually quite an interesting trend right now, because there are a few streamers that are kind of now trying to spark controversy in their streams. So they want a negative community, because a negative community is also an active community. So it's kind of no publicity is bad publicity kind of approach to it, which is of course creating a lot of, the kind of tension that you don't really want for your kids to see, for example.
Yeah. Well, it really also sounds like that today's kids are sort of learning into a sort of a statistics world, that you just have to get views, you have to get all these virtual markers in every different game or anywhere. It's kind of interesting. Should we take a couple of questions, if there are any questions, before we close the panel? Any ideas, any questions at this point? We have one here.
Question.
And
it's about how esports is associated with traditional sports. What do you think about, for example, acceptance of sports visas in America for American professional Dota 2 players, and organizing in Rio Olympics, Kyiv Olympics games, probably in two kinds, in Super Mario and in some racing game. So what do you think about this acceptance of esports?
It really ties to the first question we asked in the panel.
Yeah, I know that they organize some kind of show matches in the Olympics, and there's been talk about this kind of side track of the, or kind of side event of the Olympics being the cyber games. I myself doubt very much that we'll kind of see any type of computer games in the Olympics, partially because the titles change, you know, even though now we've had kind of a time where we have League of Legends or CSGO, but they've been like stable for a while, but kind of the Olympic kind of sports have to kind of exist in a longer time frame, especially it's like 4 years between. But on the other hand, we talk about the visas. I think they're very important for you know, enabling this kind of international competition, because I know a lot of cases where teams have had to drop out because they have Brazilian players who have a really tough time getting visas to the US, or perhaps Russian players. Of course, we here in Finland might not think about this so actively because we have an easier time getting visas to certain countries, but I mean, I've heard kind of first-hand experience of, you know, Brazilian players getting invited somewhere and kind of they would get their flights and accommodation paid and have a good chance of winning some money or something, but then kind of they get denied visa for no reason. So I think that's a very good kind of step that countries have this kind of making the eSports and traditional sports athletes equal for that.
I think the visas thing is really important, and not just for individual players, individual competitors, but eSports visas are very important for the development of eSports in the developing countries. For example, you know, recently there was a Street Fighter Championship in the Philippines, and there's no local players in the top rounds. They don't have the experience, they don't have the exposure to these kinds of tournaments, and so, you know, because they can't get visas, but not just because of esports players, but generally, you know, Filipinos find it very hard to get visas to kind of Western countries and stuff. So it's a really important issue for future development, like globally, for esports.
So maybe coming back to the very first icebreaker question, then, well, what both esports and traditional sports have in common is that sports is also like really closely related to politics. So that's something that we might maybe instead of esports following the path of sports, then esports might try to do things better from the start, maybe.
Yeah. Good question in the back.
Yeah, we have a question back.
Yeah, so my question basically revolving around the regulation. If you think about gambling, for example, in the US, there's a lot of regional regulation going on with that. There's no really common code of conduct on a global scale. Same thing with doping for the athletes themselves. There's not really a doping association like you have with the Olympics. So my question is there a consensus or some kind of idea in the academic world of if there should be an umbrella organization for regulation? Also referring to, let's say, developers who own all the rights for regulation for their games, like Riot does for League of Legends.
All right, let's take a brief comment on gambling from there. And
yeah, sure. Well, I think you very rightly pointed out that there's a huge disparity in gambling regulations. You know, from for example, from the UK to France, let alone from Japan to America. And I think part of the reason why this skins betting phenomenon has become so huge is because in America you're not allowed to bet on any sport. You're not allowed to bet on esports. You're not allowed to wager money on the outcome of basketball games. All these sites that allow you to do that are hosted in the Caribbean and various tax havens around the world, which means that they're unregulated and that they're, as mentioned before, more of a Wild West kind of atmosphere. And I think that in academia, at least, there is certainly consensus that there needs to be some kind of global or umbrella regulation. Unfortunately, it's completely, at the moment, impossible because, for example, in France, they consider esports to be one thing and they set up their own little way of monitoring and regulating esports. And in the UK, they've interpreted it completely differently. They've said that all games of skill are this type of gambling, and so they're put under the national gambling regulation. They don't create their own special esports stuff. So it's a really mixed up issue. I think that's one of the reasons why there are such problems with the lack of regulation.
I think another problem with regulation is that esports has exploded in such a way. So all of a sudden you have this like multi-billion-dollar industry, which has sprung up in not too many years. So simply the organizations and not to mention like larger umbrella structures haven't had the time to develop. So I think a lot of the similar thing is reflected in discussions on whether there should be player unions, for example, negotiating player salaries and player relationships with organizations. As for me, I'm always for more regulation. I think well, when it comes to gambling, we should have a lot more regulation. I'm very doubtful as to if it ever would be possible because of what Joe said earlier. So because there's a lot of conflicting national regulation. So I know a lot of people who are working with problem gaming, problem gambling would be elated to have international gambling regulation, but most likely not going to happen.
Yeah, I think it's going to be very similar to if you think about advertising in games. There's a regulation, but it's kind of like it's very specific and it's country specific as well as it is for gambling right now. But it's in a digital environment. When something is put down, something else will grow. I mean, there are so many mechanics that you can grow from in gambling, for example, that will be acceptable after something else is banned. So I think it's very difficult to limit that kind of creativity in the digital environment.
Yeah, I think you stated all the kind of major points, but I also think that it's just difficult from a practical standpoint, this kind of regulation, even though there should be more of it, because clearly, I mean, for example, yeah, in the US, gambling is quite regulated, so you know, casino gambling and sports gambling. So I don't see a reason why it would be impossible to then kind of extend this to also be a part of esports.
It's so young still. That really
Yes.
very much rapidly developing. Yes.
So maybe the best thing that we could get at the moment, as we don't have this umbrella organization or anything, then even like a fairly solid like set of community guidelines might be the first step. So something that developers could agree on. So for example, like enforcing age limits on gamblers, for example.
Self-regulation.
Yeah. You can always count on self-regulation in capitalism.
I think here, what Mikko said, even if it would be just like a few of the biggest ones, so if just Riot and Valve and maybe some others like Blizzard would, I mean, because companies have in the past kind of gotten kind of good societal change by just kind of coming together and seeing something done, but apparently if you look at kind of how Valve handled this CSGO thing, that people were asking them to please kind of ban the usage of your kind of interface to handle the skin trades, which would have been like, if they were really against gambling, they would have done it, but they're like, nah, we urge you not to do it, but...
And they only did it after there'd been lawsuits.
Yes. So they clearly, I mean, because they're making money out of it, so, and they don't really see they see that as more important than the moral dilemma there.
Yeah, it's a huge revenue stream, and if you look at these games, a lot of the companies sort of just have the game as a sort of a platform for virtual economy trading, which they take a big cut out. It's
Yes.
interesting. But I guess also the regulation and sort of the sustainability of gambling in esports will depend on like how sort of reasonably it's regulated, I guess. But before closing the panel, let's take maybe like maximum of 1 minute, like one interesting point, future development, or something that you're personally looking forward to or interested in.
All right. As I've been looking at streaming, I think that it will become more commonplace also outside of gaming. I'm not sure. I mean, Twitch is trying with different kind of music and creative aspects, but I think you know, media companies and the kind of advertisers and everyone has a lot to kind of good to understand where the future is heading. You know, YouTube has shown it, and streaming is kind of starting to show it already. So I think that's important for kind of future the media landscape.
Yeah, I think I'm looking forward to seeing the next generation rise to that consumer level when they're actually spending money on what they're spending money on. I was at TubeCon, like you said, and I think it was a very interesting crowd to watch. because it is that kind of peer recognition that one of your friends could just be popular overnight or something like that. So I'm really looking forward to these younger generations growing up to be consumers and seeing what that brings to this streaming culture.
In my research data, there are traces of 2 different groups of young people who are playing a lot. So playing more than 40 or 50 hours per week. And there are some of them have like problem gaming tendencies, and the others are eSports practitioners. And there's fairly little overlap between these 2 groups, and I'm super interested in how one group is able to keep a large amount of gaming unproblematic, while for others it poses a problem.
I'm particularly interested in seeing how the developments in the next few years about the viability of virtual currencies have effect on games, because I'm looking forward to seeing the first kind of in-game betting millionaire coming out, because we have in EVE Online there's gambling houses who've made a huge amount of in-game currency and really affecting the game, but they're not allowed to cash out. But soon I think they will be. There'll be ways to turn that in-game currency into hard cash, and there'll be real-world millionaires. So that'll be quite interesting to see.
Yes. So, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to our panelists. I think it was very